The public discourse is saturated with the missile threat. Contracts like Redwire's SHIELD program dominate defense analysis, focusing hardware and capital on intercepting kinetic launches. This is a calculated diversion. The fixation on launch-on-warning protocols for physical warheads misses the primary vector of attack entirely. The first strike will not be an explosion. It will be absolute silence. CSIS reports confirm the strategic vulnerability of the 1.3 million kilometers of subsea fiber optic cables that constitute the central nervous system of global finance. Cutting these is not a speculative risk. It is an asymmetric lever against a nation facing a systemic solvency crisis. Simultaneously, the attack vector opens in low Earth orbit, not with debris fields, but with targeted blinding. Analysts at RUSI document the low-cost proliferation of ground-based directed energy weapons capable of dazzling or permanently destroying imaging and communication satellites. The kinetic cost is low, the strategic impact is total. This two-pronged assault creates the blind Leviathan, a superpower with unmatched conventional force but no eyes, no ears, and severed from the global liquidity it requires to function. With its dollar already labeled overvalued by legacy financial institutions, the U.S. is rendered both information bankrupt and financially paralyzed. This is the strategic trap. A blinded, cornered power does not negotiate. It escalates. The motive for challenging U.S. hegemony is not strength. It is a systemic liability. Financial institutions now openly warn the U.S. dollar is overvalued, a clinical assessment of a structural weakness. This fragility provides the opening. For an adversary like Russia, the motive is amplified by its own internal decay. CSIS analysts frame the Ukraine war not as a war of choice, but as a solvency event, a desperate kinetic pivot to manage catastrophic domestic liabilities from an unpopular conflict. When this conventional gambit proves too costly, and the state's very solvency is on the line, its strategy is forced to change. It is a mathematical certainty. The high cost of conventional power becomes an anchor, forcing a pivot to low-cost, high-leverage asymmetric weapons as the only viable vector to exert force. Weakness forces this hand, turning the conflict into a zero-sum equation where conventional defeat makes nuclear escalation the final logical tool for survival. This is the blueprint of the strategic trap. An adversary, bankrupted by a conventional war it cannot win, but facing existential collapse if it loses, is stripped of all options but one. Their weakness makes the threat of nuclear launch on warning the only remaining leverage against a superior conventional force. This isn't a policy of madness. It's the final move in a solvency crisis. The entire blueprint for modern conflict is inverted by a single, brutal equation. According to analysts at the Royal United Services Institute, or RUSI, the kinetic cost to neutralize a $5 million main battle tank is now as low as $500. This is not a balanced exchange. It is a systemic solvency crisis for conventional military hardware. The return on investment for the attacker is 10,000 to 1. This is the new economics of lethality. This phenomenon is clinically termed the democratization of violence. It signifies the collapse of the state's monopoly on high-impact kinetic force. The barrier to entry is no longer multi-billion-dollar industrial capacity, but access to commercial supply chains. It makes military power a distributed asset, purchasable at a consumer price point. This is not a theoretical threat. Documents confirm the U.S. Army is already executing its own Swarm Forge tests, validating the very asymmetric vector that now holds its legacy platforms at risk. The theater of operations is not where the legacy media directs your attention. The true strategic staging grounds are the gray zones, nations exhibiting high degrees of internal fragility, designated by strategists as proxy laboratories. Reports of instability, such as warnings out of Canada or South Africa, are not the core crisis. They are symptoms. They function as live-fire environments to test the kinetic cost of destabilizing a Western-aligned economic node. Within these laboratories, the primary vector being tested is low-cost, mass-producible asymmetric hardware. The U.S. Army's own SwarmForge demo, which utilized drone swarms against multiple targets, is not proprietary knowledge. It is a public blueprint. Adversaries are stress testing the exact swarm density required to overwhelm infrastructure for pennies on the dollar, calibrating the attack protocols before aiming them at primary targets. The motive for activating these labs is a systemic liability. A 157-year-old financial institution publicly warns the U.S. dollar is overvalued. In strategic terms, an overvalued asset is not a strength, it is a vulnerability. These gray zone operations are designed to calculate the precise kinetic threshold required to trigger a solvency crisis in the U.S. system without crossing the line into a conventional, high-cost war. The U.S. countermove is a deployment of high-cost, technologically exquisite defenses, evidenced by contracts like Redwire's Shield missile tracking system. This creates a mathematical trap. CSIS and RUSIC models both confirm the fatal economics. An adversary can launch 1,000 low-cost kinetic assets to neutralize one high-value defensive system. The cost-exchange ratio favors the attacker exponentially. This isn't warfare, it's hostile arbitrage. Therefore, the gray zone is where the launch-on-warning threshold is being calibrated. The objective is not to defeat the U.S. military, but to make its deployment economically impossible. By perfecting asymmetric kinetic attacks in these proxy states, adversaries are engineering a scenario where any response to a financial attack is either non-existent or a nuclear escalation. The risk of political interference with the Federal Reserve, as noted by analysts, only lowers this threshold, making the system a more fragile and tempting target. The nuclear protocol is not a negotiation, it is a mathematical function. The doctrine is launch on warning. If early warning systems, like those being developed under the Redwire Shield contract, detect an incoming strategic-level kinetic event, a counterstrike is launched before the incoming assets detonate. The objective is to ensure retaliatory capability is not neutralized. This is a cold, systemic calculation, not a decision made in anger. This entire protocol is predicated on one variable: accurate data. But the modern battlefield is digital. As RUSI analysts have modeled, the new vector of attack is not kinetic, but informational. A targeted cyber attack, a blinding event, can render the entire early warning network inert. The screens go dark. This creates the fog of digital war. The commander is now blind. Is the data loss a system malfunction, or is it the prelude to a decapitation strike? The protocol offers no third option. Waiting for confirmation means accepting the risk of total asset liquidation. The cost to the adversary for this cyber attack is near zero. The potential consequence is a global solvency event. The fear of being neutralized forces the commander's hand. He must assume the worst-case scenario. The asymmetric leverage is absolute. A few lines of code create a 50-50 probability of nuclear launch. When the kinetic cost of an attack is this low, a reality demonstrated by the proliferation of cheap assets like drone swarms, the launch-on-warning doctrine ceases to be a deterrent. It becomes a systemic trap, a mathematical certainty waiting for a trigger. The calibration event will not be a missile. While defense contracts like Redwire's Shield initiative focus on high-cost kinetic threats, the vector is asymmetric and economic. Based on adversary modeling and the proliferation of systems seen in U.S. Army tests like SwarmForge, the target is systemic. Within the next 12 months, expect a coordinated, attribution impossible drone swarm to execute a non-kinetic kill on the digital infrastructure of a primary U.S. logistics hub, such as the Port of Long Beach. The objective is not destruction, but induced paralysis, a solvency test. By freezing the physical assets that underpin an economy priced in what global banks are now calling an overvalued dollar, the event demonstrates the capability to impose a systemic liquidity crisis at near zero cost. The attack will be algorithmically obscured and designed to be indistinguishable from a catastrophic cascading network failure, testing the Federal Reserve's response protocols to an economic heart attack with no identifiable assailant.